Thought Media Network. We are a global broadcast network of positive music, media, and entertainment, inspiring humanity's evolution along the journey of enlightenment and creating a world of love, peace, empowerment, and prosperity for all. New Thought Media Network. Positively inspiring.
Hey everybody, welcome to Inclusive Church. My name is Tracy Brown. I'm your host. I'm the author of the book, Stained Glass Spirit, Becoming a Spiritual Community Where Oneness Does Not Require Sameness. And the Inclusive Church show is really about, once you've made that commitment to valuing diversity and creating a spiritual community where the norm, the culture is inclusive. Once you've made that commitment, what are some things to keep in mind that will help you actually deliver on that intention or allow that vision of being inclusive to pull you in ways that affect your programming, the way that people interact and engage with one another, and how you grow and expand that commitment, not just for you as an individual leader, but for the entire community, for the collective experience. And I always do like to do a reminder that using the phrase inclusive church instead of inclusive spiritual community or inclusive spiritual center is on purpose, because I think for many years we were forgetting that the church is not a piece of property. It's not the building that we might meet in. It's really, the church is really the people who come together, and in an environment where we have people who are very different from one another, very different backgrounds, very different experiences. I want us to be really clear that when we are talking about building our church, we are talking about building a multi-ethnic, multicultural, multi-generational grouping or community of people where they do come together in unity. So, Inclusive Church, that's what we're about. And during the month of September 2025, we are really diving into a book, Finding Refuge. And the subtitle is Heart Work for Healing and Collective Grief. And you don't have to have read the book, right? There's no reason that you have to have read the book in order to participate in this conversation, because today I will be, and then throughout the month, I'll have different guests joining me, and we'll be giving you highlights from the different parts of the book, and we'll also be challenging you to think about some of the messages that are in the book. And you don't have to read the book in order to be able to engage in that. So that's where we're going this month. Finding Refuge, Heart Work for Healing Collective Grief. Now, of course, there will be many people who will be like, why this book? There's nothing that says inclusion in the title of this book. And it says the subtitle says it's about grief, and what's that got to do with inclusion? And so I do want to take just a couple of minutes, maybe 3 or 4 minutes, to talk about why this book. So, Finding Refuge, I always thought was an interesting title. And I'll admit, when I first purchased the book, which was a couple of years ago, maybe even 3 years ago, I kind of knew who the author Michelle Cassandra Johnson was, but I knew that she did a lot of work with somatic practices and healing and spiritual kind of integrating your spiritual belief system and values with the way you live your life. But I didn't connect it at all with diversity or inclusion or multiculturalism very much at all. But once I read this book, I remember thinking how practical it was. And I remember thinking that the way she talked about healing grief was revealing the complexity of our collective grief about systemic issues and challenges, right? So you might assume, because you can look at me and see that I am a Black woman, that if there is some grief about racism in the world and the history of racism in the world, and that, I've been hurt by that, or my family members have been hurt by that, or people of African descent have been hurt by that, that maybe I would be sad about that. And the way that the author writes in this book, it's a reminder that everybody is impacted by that, by societal things that happen, or the cultural norms that exist have an impact, and everyone could be feeling grief because of what they are missing out on by perpetuating the system. And so, again, it's easy to look at me and say, oh, Tracy, you're Black. And so in the places in the book where she talks about impact for her as a woman of African descent, it's like, oh, no wonder you like it. But she does a really good job of, basically reminding us that there are people who are white, whether their ancestors owned slaves or not, they benefited from the system, and they also could be grieving, and maybe should be grieving, but could be grieving if they recognize how much productivity was lost, how much was lost by not seeing Black people as whole, perfect, and complete, how much was lost by recognizing that Black people were mistreated, but not standing up. Like, there's some mourning and there's some grief that, oh, I didn't stand up for everyone to be treated equally, fairly, respectfully. And this would be true. Let's go away from racism. We can look at homophobia. We can look at the way that people are treated, dismissed, discounted based on mental or physical disabilities. We can look at the distinction of how people are treated relative to their generation or age group that has nothing to do with capability or skill, right? And so I got fascinated. I remember being fascinated when I first read it. And then, like you, my life is really busy, and I, read it. I loved the book. And after a few months, I started reading something else and kind of forgot about it. So if you're a regular follower of the Inclusive Church Show, then you know a few weeks ago, I pulled the book off the shelf really just to take a quote, find a quote that I could use for the show. And just thumbing through the book, I was like, oh my goodness, we really just need to talk about this whole book, because there were quotes I wanted to pull from every single chapter. And it's like, okay, we're going to talk about the book. And September is the month chosen. And that's why we are focusing on this book, Finding Refuge, Heart Work for Healing Collective Grief during the month of September. Now, if you're not familiar with the author, I do want to tell you a little bit about her as well. Let's talk a little bit about the author. So the way that she defines herself, I find really interesting. And partly I think I find it interesting because, I too have, as an author, you have to describe, or decide what you want the reader who's never met you before. What do you want them to know about you? How will you describe yourself in a way that not necessarily pumps you up, but gives them some little sense of who you are? And so the way that Michelle Cassandra Johnson describes herself as like a list of adjectives, right? Author, activist, spiritual teacher, racial equity consultant, and educator. And then she adds that she is both an intuitive and a shamanic healer. And so that combination of kind of concrete labels, racial equity consultant, educator, a spiritual teacher. So you've got some concrete and some spiritual. And then I'm guessing that she actually had to do some thinking before she added on intuitive and shamanic healer. Because some people would think, oh, well, she's just kind of a little strange, right? But I think it's important as we dive into the book to understand that she is living a life where she is intentionally integrating the practical and the spiritual. And she's crossing lots of boundaries in doing that. It's not that she just does one thing. And that she is healing herself, but she's also in the work of healing other people. She then also describes herself, if you were to visit her website, she describes herself, but then she talks about what's important about the work that she does and the topics that she writes about. And she says that everything she does, even though it may look really different, shamanic healing may look really different than being an activist, and an activist may look really different than being a yoga teacher, right? But all of it is centered around healing, helping people heal both individually and collectively from trauma, returning to wholeness. And for inclusive church, that's really, it's evident in so much of what she writes, and it's so connected to what we do in our new thought spiritual communities. We're constantly putting our attention on what does wholeness look like. What do I need to do to contribute to wholeness in my life and in the experience of the world? And then number three, that she's centering her work around aligning mind, body, spirit, and heart. And I know I resonate with that, and so many of you also resonate with that, because we recognize that understanding or knowing about spiritual principle is great. But if we don't align and if we don't integrate it into the way we think every day, the behavioral choices we make, and our ongoing spiritual practice, then we may know a lot, but our lives won't necessarily change or reflect what is important to us. So this book is giving us an example during the month of September to really think about and dive more deeply into how we recognize grief, what the grief is about, and how do we move from assuming grief is just an individual problem to be hidden to something that both individually and collectively we can recognize and heal together, some by talking, some by doing spiritual practice together, and some by sharing with others. So this is our journey. This is our journey over the next 4 weeks. And I'm going to today talk a little bit about the introduction of the book, and how the author frames the entire book, and some definitions that she believes are really important for us to know, understand, or at least know and understand how she is using these terms in the context of this book. So let's talk about the introduction. Oh, I have a note to myself before going to the introduction. Read the first paragraph in the acknowledgments that the author made before diving into the book. First, and this is quoting Michelle Cassandra Johnson. First, I want to acknowledge my ancestors, in particular Dorothy, my maternal grandmother. My ancestors are responsible for my being. They are responsible for my work, and their support allows me to bring their dreams from the spiritual world into the material world. They shepherded me through a very difficult time that was filled with grief and loss, because they knew I would land in a place that was filled where my spiritual practice could support me in responding to the grief that desperately needs to be felt and witnessed at this time. Thank you to the ancestors known to me and unknown. Thank you to the healthy ancestors who do their magic from the other side. End quote. I loved this, and I love it now, even though I've read it a number of times, because so often we forget that there have been people who have come before us who have lived through similar experiences or even more challenging experiences. And they become that rock to stand on. They become the reminder that this too shall pass. They become the wisdom to tap into and to not get stuck in current today ego and drama, etc., etc. And so I love that she started off her acknowledgments, thanking and acknowledging ancestors. And then when she gets into the introduction, um, she titled the introduction "Turning Toward My Own Grief." So this introduction is totally her story and her sharing some of the things that brought her to the place of needing to recognize the impact of culture on both individual and group experiences. And that's when she began truly working on what kinds of spiritual practices help me individually and help the people in the classes that I'm leading or the workshops that I'm facilitating. And it ultimately shows up in this book. So again, I can summarize it for you, but I want to give you a feel for her writing and for her willingness to be vulnerable and share. And I also want you to get a sense of, as she tells her story, what might be the inciting incidents or circumstance that might shift you into recognizing the same pattern. So this is the beginning of the introduction of Finding Refuge, Artwork for Healing Collective Grief by Michelle Cassandra Johnson. I remember the morning after. I was in bed, unable to rise up and face the day. I had gone out to dinner with a friend the night before and had come home to the news that George Zimmerman had been acquitted for the murder of Trayvon Martin. I was standing in my kitchen holding my phone and I fell to the floor upon reading the news. I don't remember all the details. Trauma doesn't allow one to remember everything as it happens. I do remember the cold concrete floor, the sound of my wailing, and my heart shattering in a way that felt irreparable. I felt dismembered, as if all the ancestral trauma of living in a Black body in a culture that doesn't value Blackness came out through tears, snot, and screams. I sat on the floor for what felt like hours, unable to stand up. End quote. Now, it doesn't hurt that she's a good writer. It doesn't hurt at all. But the question is not, did I agree with her reaction? Was my reaction the same as her reaction when George Zimmerman was acquitted? Because we already know there's a whole continuum of reaction that happened when George Zimmerman was acquitted. It's not about agreeing or disagreeing with that. It's about recognizing that what happened to her was this sense of ancestral, like all of, it wasn't just George Zimmerman being acquitted. It was the history, decades and centuries of similar things happening, and recognizing that I am affected by that. And yes, her reaction was emotional and it was some might say PTSD, right? It was a trauma reaction. So on the next page, a little bit later, she describes this quote: "At that moment, there was no way for me to separate my grief from all the losses Black people have endured due to white supremacy. I wanted everything to stop and for everyone to feel the gravity of what it meant to lose Trayvon, a Black child who had gone to the store to buy candy and never made it back home. What happened instead was the world kept spinning, and while some felt deeply affected by the death of Trayvon and subsequent acquittal of George Zimmerman, others felt completely numb to the gravity of it all." So, what in your life, maybe you are a member of the LGBTQ plus community, and you can think of things that have happened in our world where it didn't happen to you personally, but it happened to you in a personal way. Your trauma reaction reflected the trauma of decades or centuries of hatred or violence or oppression for a group you're in. Maybe you're a part of, or you are in the identity group of baby boomers who are aging, and you have something that has happened in the last 5 years or 10 years in the news or in the world or in your life that has connected to that trauma of, oh, this is how our society treats the elderly, and I feel completely dismissed and I have grief about that. The way that Michelle Cassandra Johnson talks about, even when she's using her own personal experience, she does a really good job of, as we go through the book, of saying, for you, it may not be your racial identity. It may be some other identity. And if you're a part of a spiritual community, if you are a leader in a church where there are many different kinds of people, if you say you want to be inclusive, then you actually must become aware of what are the trauma responses, what grief has been caused, or what grief are people experiencing because of these trauma experiences, these trauma conditions, and how do I not just support Tracy in her individual journey through coaching and counseling and and affirmations, but how can we do this together for and with each other? This is why we are diving into this book, Finding Refuge, Healing Heart Work for Healing Collective Grief, for the next few weeks. In this introduction, the author also writes this: "We are holding grief in our bodies and bones, often in isolation. And yet, our grief isn't isolated, it is pervasive. Our grief isn't isolated, but we treat it as if it's one per individual person's weakness. Oh, well, you need therapy. Or, oh, well, I've had people say to me, oh, well, I'm not going to come to church because, I should be over my grief about what happened, right? Even though I find the people in my church are my community, maybe there are 3 or 4 who I see away from church, and I might lean into them a little bit, but even them, I don't want them to think I don't have strong faith, right? Why do I feel so bad? And so we stuff our grief, we hide our grief instead of actually leaning into each other and our spiritual practices to heal the grief. Or if you are in the New Thought, under the New Thought umbrella, and part of religious science or science of mind, you might be hearing your subconscious say, there's nothing to heal, only truth to reveal. But from our human perspective, it's the process of healing that sadness, that grief, that fear, that anger that is popping up so that the truth can reveal itself, the truth of wholeness, the truth of love, the truth of joy, the truth of light. So I hope that you are getting really inspired to dive into this with me. We're diving in today, just understanding what is the overview of the book and where is the author coming from. And then in each chapter, there are specific practices. I have this underlined from a previous reading. Finding Refuge is a book designed to guide you through exploring what is breaking your heart. And I have to breathe on that one because when George Floyd was murdered 5 years ago, and so many people kept saying to me, this just breaks my heart. This just breaks my heart that another Black man was killed and probably while in police custody, and the police probably will not have any consequences. This just breaks my heart that our society is still has racism so openly and overtly demonstrated. This just breaks my heart. I don't know what to do about it, but it's just so sad that we treat each other this way. And I ended up writing a poem. If this breaks your heart, then basically do something about it. Speak up about it. Join protests about it. Do change your behavior so that you know you are doing things that will be a contribution toward changing this condition that breaks your heart. So, yes, I remember when I read this. This book is designed to guide you through exploring what's breaking your heart. What I love about this book is it doesn't make you wrong or right, but it does guide you and give you the opportunity to say, this does break my heart. This pattern over centuries breaks my heart. This pattern and the impact it has on people of a certain group, identity group, breaks my heart. But instead of ignoring it, instead of bypassing it, instead of thinking it's someone else's job to fix or to heal, this book challenges us to make a commitment to do the healing together in our church, in our spiritual community. And that's why we're talking about it on the Inclusive Church. So, the next thing that the author does in this book is, before going into all of the details in the remaining chapters, she writes this in this next section. Language is a powerful tool. The way one uses language can shape and shift culture. In Finding Refuge, I use terminology that may be new to you or may be used in a different way than you are accustomed to. And it's important to have a shared understanding of language as one explores these concepts of cultural trauma, systemic oppression, and collective grief. So she also has a lot of these in a previous book that she wrote called Skill in Action, which really was very much focused specifically on the impact of race, and there was quite a bit in there around feminist theory as well. And so these are, for the most part, not terms that she just made up, but she does give context. And so as we go through the different chapters, we will make sure that we remind you of the definitions that she's using in the book. But these are some of the words that she actually defines. So she does talk about culture, dominant culture, social location, and how that impacts our grief and our patterns, cisgender, intersectionality, trauma, cultural trauma, collective grief, oppression, and privilege. And a couple of these are definitely examples of, they're words that you may think you know the definition of, like privilege, but in the context of us talking about social systems and social justice or social activism or sacred activism, it's important that we actually define the terms. So if you have the book, or if you end up buying the book, all of the definitions are in there. But we will make sure that we highlight some of them or share the definition in chapters where some of these are used. The additional words or terms that she defines in the book are white supremacy, racism, suffering, spiritual bypassing, liberation, oppression takes the breath away, living ancestor, spirit, and then she has a section on the approach and the assumptions that she is using as she goes through the book. So I hope this is helpful for you, giving you a little context about where we're going and how we're going to go through this book. Already, just in talking about the introduction, a couple of really key points that I want you to keep in mind. This book is about grief that is anchored in systemic trauma, about grief that we have all embodied as a result of what is going on in our culture, and not then to leave us there, but to give us the opportunity to choose to feel the grief, because often we've been raised to stuff it or ignore it or pretend it's not real, or it's not having a real impact on the way we engage with one another. So how we can feel the grief in a healthy way, how we can witness the grief, the impact of grief on others, and do that from a place of spiritual intention to be on this journey to return to wholeness. I can't think of a better thing for us to talk about on the New Thought Media Network or in our New Thought spiritual communities than healing, recognizing healing collective and individual grief, so that we can be full examples of wholeness and love. So I'm going to stop there because I think that's a good beginning of understanding what this book is about. And today it really is just, what's the book about? And next week we'll dive into chapter 1, which is titled, actually we'll do chapters 1 and 2. Chapter 1 is titled, I am going to find it. I know you're watching me look for the contents page. Chapter 1 is titled The Root. And it's like, what is the root of this grief experience that we're having? And chapter 2 is a little of this practice. And Reverend Rafe Ellis will be joining me for that conversation around chapters 1 and 2 next week. And every week after that, I will invite you to please join in on the conversation. This is really, really important work. And Marjorie, you are so correct that grief is a universal byproduct of love, right? We experience the grief, right, kind of as the balance, however much we loved or love someone, we experience the grief. And when we're talking about societal norms, right, the grief that we feel when someone we love dies, or when we experience a major injury and now we are grieving the way we thought our life was going to be on an individual level. Now let's multiply that by millions when we talk about the patterns of, for example, we say if we live in the United States where everyone is free and where we are, all have the right to pursue happiness, and we love and value that concept. But we live in a society where that concept is not demonstrated, has not been demonstrated, and a lot of times we don't even recognize that we are grieving what we're missing from the values that we love or that we believe should be. That is a grief. When we take it out of politics and take it into the expression of spiritual wholeness and wellness and harmony, the spiritual definition of harmony and unity, we've got some healing to do. And I am so glad that you've decided to do some of that healing with me this month and with my featured guests as we talk about and dive more into the book, Finding Refuge, Heart Work for Healing and Collective Grief. My name is Tracy Brown. Thanks for being with me this week. Hope to see you every week in September and beyond on the Inclusive Church right here on the New Thought Media Network.
Thanks for watching The Inclusive Church with Tracy Brown. Join us again next week at 12 noon Mountain Time.
On behalf of everyone at New Thought Media Network, thank you for being a member of our virtual family. Your financial contributions help share the New Thought message with people from around the world. Please visit and contribute at www.ntmedia.org/donate. New Thought Media Network, come be you. And please like, share, and subscribe. Until next time, peace and blessings.